Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, the Opus 4.8 of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is Tuhin Chakrabarty, an assistant professor of computer science at Stony Brook University and the author of some really fascinating research about creativity and AI. Before I tell you what that research is about, what we're going to be talking about, I want to give my first ever trigger warning on Eminent Americans. So here we go. If a big part of your identity is vested in being a writer or intellectual, as mine is, and you are already experiencing existential dread about the prospect of AI getting better than you at writing, as I have been experiencing, you may not want to listen to this podcast, or at least if you do, you may want to take a Xanax or half a gummy before listening. So to be clear, Tuhin doesn't know where AI will plateau when it comes to this question, what its ultimate limitations may be, whether it will or won't surpass not just the median of us, as it already has in the realm of writing, but the best of us. And in fact, I would say there's a way to interpret his research that's somewhat reassuring, that highlights how limited LLMs still are in some realms when compared to us. But I'm not sure that his lack of prophetic power about where we're going, or even the possibility of interpreting his research in a reassuring way, is likely to make this a less anxiety-producing conversation. Because what I've found, what I think is the case, is that often it's having to stay in the questions for a while, having to kind of live in the uncertainty that is the hardest thing, the most anxiety-producing thing. And that is, in a sense, a description of the conversation that Tuhin and I have. I mean, I didn't find it anxiety-producing. I actually found it anxiety-assuaging for a variety of reasons. But I want to be clear on what it is we're doing. We take this utterly fascinating research he's done, where he trained AI to produce super high-quality samples of high literary writing, and then we subject his findings to all the obvious questions I have. So how does it work? What is it doing? What does and doesn't it prove? Why did it occur to him to do it in the first place? What are its implications kind of in the near term, in the far term? And what technical challenges would need to be solved for it to move from where it is now, where it can make short samples that are persuasive, not just to kind of the median reader, but to really sophisticated writers and readers. But it can do so only when you give it detailed plot points and themes, when a human does that. So how would it get from there to actually generating a full book with just a short prompt or maybe a broad outline or something like that? And then also, what are we human writers owed if it's our work used as training data, reinforcement learning, et cetera, that ends up creating the conditions for being superseded by AI? So we take on those questions and more. You know, I wrote a long essay not too long ago about my experiments with AI, my thinkings about it. And ultimately, the argument was that I think most of the most kind of passionately articulated current responses out there fall into two camps, both of which, from my perspective, are kind of dysfunctional manifestations of the same anxiety, which is a wholly reasonable anxiety that many of us have right now, that we may be facing an extinction-level event when it comes not to our physical bodily lives, but when it comes to some of the ways we've understood what it means to be human and how we've constructed our purpose as humans. So one of those two responses, the dysfunctional ones, is kind of what I think of as the utopian boosterist response, that, you know, this is AI is going to the moon and back. We're going to be colonizing Mars. We're going to be in a post-scarcity age, et cetera, et cetera. And the other one, I think, is just kind of the opposite of it, is the kind of the not just the skeptics, but the people who just think it's irredeemably evil, the people who think that it will never surpass humans in all of our most sort of humane qualities. The people who, from my perspective, are kind of, you know, head in the sand about it, not sort of trying to at least think about what it might mean if significant amount of its promise is realized. I can imagine that people, including listeners, may not love the work that Tuhin is doing, which involves training AI on the corpuses of real human writers. And as we discuss, he has gotten a bit of hate for it. But from my perspective, he is dealing with this kind of existential threat we face in exactly the right way, the psychologically functional way, which is he's looking directly at it. He's rejecting both that utopian boosterism and the head in the sand denialism, which I see as strategies of evasion of the anxiety. He's being creative with the thing itself. He's kind of working with AI. He's using the skills and the expertise he has and the interest to kind of explore what's going on with this new technology. And he's also, it's worth mentioning, thinking in super pragmatic ways about how best to serve human interests in the long run. And by that, I don't mean that he's just thinking about it, but he's actually been collaborating with legal scholars on how we might want to think about and craft policies that protect and compensate the human authors, without whom the LLMs would not be able to do what it is they're doing now, and whatever it is in the future they'll be doing will be built ultimately upon a foundation of human creativity and intelligence. So he's one of, from my perspective, he's one of the good guys. And so I'm sorry in advance to stoke your anxieties if this conversation does. But I am not sorry that I had Tuhin on the show. He's a fascinating and flexible thinker. And also, it's worth noting that in addition to being a hardcore computer scientist, he is a real lover of serious literature, which is kind of how he ended up in this research place in the first place. So yeah, I hope you enjoy and kind of take as much kind of intellectual satisfaction from this conversation as I did. This is the second episode produced in collaboration with the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, and is distributed through its publication, ARC Magazine. You can find all of ARC's podcasts and much more online at arcmag.org, arcmag.org. Also, I usually forget to say this at the front of the show, but it feels important, especially given our new affiliation and also, I think, our likely increased productivity over the next months and years, that if you want to contact me with comments, questions, suggestions for future guests, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's D for Daniel, J for James, Ops for Oppenheimer @gmail.com. Yeah, so I hope that the radiant beams of humanity and thoughtfulness that Tuhin and I generate between us don't just soothe your anxiety, but ultimately help you to process it and move forward into a higher state of enlightenment when it comes to AI and the challenges it poses and the promises it potentially makes. Peace. Tuhin, welcome to Eminent Americans. I hereby anoint you an eminent American by the power vested in me in Claude Fable 5.0, which I think, as far as I know, I haven't checked this morning, is not available to us. Is that right?
I suppose so. I mean, the export control was lifted, so I guess now everyone should have access to it.
Oh, is that right? Okay. When was it lifted? I thought, as of like yesterday, I thought that I couldn't have it. Anyway, I'm not going to look right now. So, Tuhin, I have lots of questions in all sorts of realms. I tend to be somewhat digressive in my interviewing style. And because of that, I kind of want to start with just some top level stuff about you and your work. You're an assistant professor at Stony Brook of computer science. You have been in the news in various ways, including very prominently in a New Yorker essay that came out, I think, in December of last year, because you study kind of AI and creativity, and you've done some really fascinating experiments where you've trained AI on the sort of full corpuses of various authors, and then seen how good the writing was that was produced in that way in terms of emulating those writers. So I do want to get into all of that, but maybe just like from your perspective, what is your sort of brief summary of who you are and the work you do? And then we'll get into kind of essentially whatever we're interested in talking about.
Yeah. So I sort of predominantly describe myself and my research as like something that is human centered. Like, I'm not interested so much around the questions about sort of hyping AI or calling AI sentient, or like sort of like describe or sort of like ascribing some sort of like human like agency to AI when we certainly do not know what it is. But I also do not belong to that kind of researcher who sort of like call LLM stochastic parrots, or like so I think our understanding of how LLMs behave, or like how LLMs sort of like work, is still sort of, I would say, primitive, right? I mean, interpretability research hasn't done that much of progress, and there's been some degree of work being done to understand how these models behave, like but I still feel there is this sort of like it's still only a sliver of our human brain. I mean, I don't necessarily think we know exactly what's happening. So what I try to focus on is, in terms of like creative thinking or creativity, this kind of like traits which fundamentally or intrinsically have always been ascribed to human beings, right? I could never imagine an AI writing a 10,000 word short story when I started my PhD, but here we are now, it's being able to do it. So I don't want to at the same time dismiss it as like, okay, this model does not have any understanding, because if it didn't, then it wouldn't be able to produce it. So I guess from the intellectual side of being a computer scientist, I do agree that this is kind of monumental progress. But at the same time, as a human centered researcher, what interests me is that if we are getting to that point where I can write a 10,000 word short story, how is it doing it? It's only doing it because it's a function of being trained on human labor and human data. So how do we understand that world? And if we are to sort of like exist in this kind of a post AGI world where AI is doing most of the things, like how do we still maintain human agency? How do human beings still survive? I don't live in San Francisco, so I don't believe in like this kind of permanent underclass kind of thing. But what I do believe is that there needs to be mechanisms to sort of like give it back to humans.
Yeah.
And this could be something as political as what Bernie Sanders has said about like that public needs to have a sort of share in AI companies. But what I think is more important is, especially for creatives, like what are some of the ideal ways of licensing? Like if an AI is generating something creative, which is basically a function of being trained on my or your data, is there some way to know this? Can we sort of give it back? Can we just let AI companies steal our data without any consequences? Or is copyright still valid? I mean, if you go talk to like AI researchers in Silicon Valley, they just don't give a fuck
Right.
about copyright. So
I can imagine.
but I do. My work is pretty much on that. In fact, the New Yorker essay that you were
Yeah.
mentioning was, I mean, even though the experiment was very sort of interesting, I mean, the bigger underlying theme there was about substitutes, which is very important in copyright law, right? I mean, um, and this is in writing, but in music we are already seeing,
Yeah.
right? There are like Taylor Swift like clones, like these kind of like slap music is like charting, like is on top of charts on Spotify. So yeah, I guess like that's pretty much what I'm interested now.
Yeah.
I want to know that if AI is getting better at these kind of creative tasks, how is it getting better? How much of that originality is just coming from AI versus how much of that is coming from humans? Like I have no interest in anthropomorphizing AI as something which it's not.
So, I should say, and you will not be remotely surprised to discover this, that I found my way to you via AI. And, and the backstory, I think, is relevant in the sense that I just became interested, I think, as a writer, and I have no technical background. I'm probably somewhat more fluent in sciences in some sense than a lot of humanists, because I spent many years doing sort of PR communications for College of Natural Sciences, so I at least learned how to read a scientific paper, and I have some facility with it, but none of the kind of basic, the core basic knowledge. And I was interested in, from my perspective, I think some of the very same questions you were, which is, what can this thing do? So before we get into these questions of human versus AI, like I was interested, what can this thing do? And also, how likely is it, or how quickly is it going to be that it can do what I can do at my best, which is write nonfiction articles as well as I do, right? And so I don't know who to talk to about this, right? Like my writer friends are not interested in it. They're sort of aversive to it. I know some kind of LLM researchers, but they're not the kind of people I can just call up and shoot the shit with, right? So what do? I talk to AI. I just get on the horn with Claude, and I start asking it questions about, how good is it right now at emulating human writing? How good will it be? What is this thing when we're talking about something reading like slop, when something reads like AI? What is the distinction we're drawing? What is the distinctive quality, at this moment at least, of human writing? And why is it we can sometimes detect when something reads like AI, even though we already know, before you train it, before you do sophisticated things where you train it on like some brilliant author's corpus, it's already better than, 80, 90% of the population in some basic way, right? It's already writing better college essays in some technical sense than most college students. But, it doesn't seem to be as good yet as me at my best, right? And so I'm asking all of these questions and I'm trying to kind of understand it. And then I'm saying to it, well, who out there? So I've run out of I get to the limit of what AI seems to be able to give me, maybe in part because I'm not sufficiently technical enough to know how to ask the questions, how to prompt it in a way that'll give me refined answers. I have no one to talk to. I'm like, well, who the hell should I talk to? Right? So then it starts giving me researchers, right? And I'm filtering between them and I'm trying to look for exactly the right person. And so it finally gets to you, right? And then I'm reading your stuff. And I don't think you were the first one I came to. So it gives me various names. And I look at that. It's like, no, that's not quite what I write. And I finally get to you. And I mean, and I'm sure you'll tell me that you're not literally the only person, but you were literally the only person I found who seemed to be right in this very specific spot where you were asking a lot of the questions I have, but with the sort of technical knowledge and sophistication, not just to ask the questions, but to run the experiment. So that's how I got to you. And I guess I want to start before we get into some of the nuances, which is how did you get there? I mean, am I right? You're not that far out of grad school?
Yeah, I mean, I finished my PhD in 2024.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess yeah, I mean, how I got there is interesting. I mean, I guess I really enjoy reading a lot of literary fiction. So I guess I've very long thought about like literary fiction as something that is very intrinsically human, which probably is very difficult for AI to do because again, as you said, AI can write some sort of like formulaic prose, which you can see in like genre fiction or even like self-help books and stuff. But literary fiction is just so like based on human experience, and there is subtext, and like it's very hard. So so I guess like there's a lot of work in general going on in AI and fiction writing, but I guess like no one ever thought about like the highbrow, like elite literary fiction, right? So, so the bigger thing is like, of course, now AI is being able to do like very sophisticated math, like something that
Yep.
like, so the bigger question is if it's able to do so much good in STEM, will it ever reach this point where it would write something that is very profound and moving to like a human? So so one thing is definitely originality is something that AI potentially lacks because of course it doesn't have the human experience. It's approximating what it has seen on the internet or training data. So my bigger question was that say if I'm providing the original experience to the AI, can it then put things in words that is beautiful and
Yep.
that sort of moves me and even other gatekeepers in the field? Like so I don't want to ask if AI writing is good to like say a random crowd worker because I don't think there is anything going to come out of that.
Right.
But if I ask, so
Well,
I've,
right, and I
in the
just to draw out that
past,
point, we already know that if you ask like a median American, they might like Thomas Kincaid's painting of like a. Do you know Kincaid? It's the
yeah,
yeah. They might like a Thomas Kincaid painting of a kind of cozy cottage in a woods, in a with a snow draped forest more than they like a Rembrandt or something like that. That's not the question
sure,
we're trying to answer, right? We already
yes,
know that a
yes.
lot of people like formulaic slop. Essentially, they like formulaic human produced slop more than they like what we think of as the really refined stuff. That's not the question you're trying to answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like my bigger question was that like what is the pinnacle of excellence which we can sort of like go with AI? Because again, of course, like commercial aspects of writing is very different from the award-winning writing,
Right.
right? I mean, Colleen Hoover's books are extremely popular. I have never read even one of her books. I don't see myself as that kind of person who reads that kind of literature. So again, no shade to people who do, but I guess like if the goal is to make AI do that, it's already doing very well. I have a paper coming out in 2 weeks where we show that AI generated these genre fiction slab books are very profitable and it's all over Amazon. But that was never my intention for the first project. So yeah, this got me to like think about it and then also think about like copyright because it's like when people, I mean, all these books are inside language models,
Yep.
like language models have been trained on these books. So the bigger question is that why is the language model still not being able to write that well even though they have been trained on all these like on these books, and what do we have to do to get these AI models sort of like write in a way that is at least similar to what an expert human is writing. So what can we do to that? And of course, because these language models are trained with like reinforcement learning from human feedback, they kind of are sycophantic. They have all these like writing idiosyncrasies or tics, like negative parallelisms, rule of triads. So which makes it very jarring. If you read it for the first time, it's fine, but once you've read enough
Yeah.
of it, you that's what people call as like slop. Um, so yeah, so our point was that okay, if the AI writes like that, what do people think? Like both experts, like say MFA students from like very top programs or the Writers Workshop at Iowa or like Michigan, etc. And then if we take that population away and just ask the general median people who do not necessarily need read very avant-garde fiction, where what do they think? And one thing was very interesting is when we just did prompting, it seemed that the experts they hated that kind of
Yeah.
writing, right? Because
Yep.
it was very cliche written, very purple prose. But the average median people already like that better than the MFA style
Right.
because, and this is again not like surprising to me. The average median American is not reading Pulitzer Prize winning fiction. They don't necessarily care about that. So I guess like it's all about taste, right? And I guess right now there's a lot of work going on to like teach AI taste because again, taste is something that is acquired. You necessarily cannot reinforcement learn that taste. So anyway, so that was somewhat interesting as a finding, but it was not too surprising to me us as a research group. So then we were like, oh, what if we do something to like change the model parameters to make it more closer to the universe of the actual author? So then we did this fine tuning experiment. And the fine tuning experiments were very interesting. So after fine tuning the kind of text that the model generated, I was very surprised by it,
Yeah.
because again, some of these writers in our experiments they used to write in sort of very profane language, like because AI would never use the N word. AI would never like write something that is sort of like ribald or like overly sexual.
Yeah, I was going to say
But
there was an example, and I'm not sure if this is something you did or it was something that she did in the article, but the author of the New Yorker article, Vahini Vara, had you
yeah,
done something on Tony? I never know how to say
yeah,
it.
Yeah, I did that, Tony Tulathamuti. So
Yeah, and
so
it
yeah,
produced something. Do you remember what it was? It produced something very, very profane, right?
yeah, it said something about like it said it would propose to the man who made it was a gay man,
Yeah,
and it was saying that the gay man was saying in sort of an autobiographical voice that he would propose to the first man who made him come without dildos or videos,
right.
which was kind of very darkly funny. And I know I have read Tony Tulathamuti, so I know that is exactly the kind of thing he would write. So it was kind of fascinating to see that this kind of an original line, which is at the same time dark, funny, and reflective of the zeitgeist of growing up as a gay man. I mean, how would it do that? And the only reason it would do that is because it is trained on a lot of like that kind of literature or like that kind of internet sort of like blogs or like magazines. So it's not surprising that it could do it, but it's just the fact is that this capability is camouflaged by this alignment algorithm. So
Right.
so the what fine tuning does, it just unlearns these sort of like
Well, so actually,
guardrails.
let me pause on that for a second because that may be a thing that's kind of self-explanatory to more technical listeners, but to people like me and probably a lot of my readers, I want to understand what fine-tuning means because one of the things I ran up against when I was doing this kind of before I reached out to you when I was doing this kind of back and forth with Claude was I felt like I could not get it to, and this is something because I vibe coded an app and I ran into this as well, which is I kept running up against the limits of its kind of default sort of parameters, its default orientation, and did not feel like it felt like getting it out of that was I was going to say incredibly hard, but maybe impossible. And I wondered at some point if, in order to really tune it in the way I would want to, I would have to go to one of these open source models that allowed for more tuning on sort of what of data that information I was feeding into it. So for me, just kind of lay out what fine tuning was in your case. Did you have access to a sort of open source model that allowed you to do things that I cannot do with just the off the shelf ChatGPT or Claude?
Yeah, so very funnily, OpenAI ChatGPT allows fine tuning for now.
Oh, okay.
So it's planning to discontinue it in next year January, but until then you still have time. So what I did is I did fine tune the GPT-4o model. So at that point of time, fine tuning was available via their API. So as you know, I mean, you can just go to the web and just chatgpt.com and just ask anything, but then you can also use an API to like get responses. So similarly, they also have a fine tuning API. And what fine tuning does is it basically changes the weight of the model. So you have some training data, and then the model is trying to optimize on that particular training data, which means that whatever the model weights and parameters are, it's sort of updating them to make it closer to your target task.
Yeah.
So say for instance, the model is trained on so much of text, but I want the model to just give me vegan recipes. So basically, I can just crawl all vegan recipes from New York Times Cooking, and then if I train the model, then the model will be very good at providing me accurate vegan recipes, which it might not be able to give based on everything that it's been trained on. So similarly for writing, the model is trained on a lot of crappy, horrible writing. But if I really want the model to emulate Tony Tulathamuti's voice and style and universe, I mean, he doesn't have that much of text on the internet, right? So his writing is very small approximation of everything that's in the pre-training data. So I would need the model to just zoom in on that.
Right.
So for that, I need to fine tune, which if you just ignore the technical
Yeah.
meaning of fine tune, what you're doing is just usually making it more closer to your actual.
You're feeding it all of his work. You're feeding it a bunch of PDFs. And you're
Yes,
telling
yes,
it as you're doing it that it is supposed to disproportionately weight this specific stuff that you're feeding it in
yes, higher
in
than.
its output. Whereas in that first experiment you were talking about, you were running, which was just a general prompt, you were asking it to create stuff, and it was drawing on this vast universe of training data, which is kind of averaging everything out. And that's the thing that produces the kind of slop, the formulaic content. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yes,
Okay.
yes.
So you had this
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
some of the articles about your work, you had this kind of middle of the night epiphany, right? Or that's at least one way it was framed, where you fed it. Who was it? You fed it all of the work of one of the recent. Yeah.
Han Kang,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was taking a short sort of like break from work, which is very stupid to say now when I think about it, because all I did was work during that trip. Um,
Right.
but I fooled myself into believing that I'm gonna take like a small break from research. And then I arrived in Tokyo, and then of course there was a huge jet lag, so I was sort of like, and I was reading. I think I was reading at that point of time White Book, which I think I do have here. So this is the book that I was reading on my vacations. I had just finished reading it,
Mm-hmm.
and there was this one chapter which was really, really beautiful. I mean, I don't know if you've read Han Kang, but
I
like
haven't. No.
she's the Korean Nobel Prize winner in 2024, and she writes in this very intensely poetic prose. It's not ornamental, but at the same time, it almost feels that you're reading fiction, which reads like poetry. So it was beautiful. And then um, there was this there was this chapter about the narrator talking about how her mother lost her first child in like very brutal winter in a Korean village, and then just the agony and the sort of like harrowing experience of a mother losing her child, and it just was beautiful. So I was like, yeah, I mean, and then by that time we'd already done a lot of these experiments with prompting, and I had seen that the prompting was not that good. So then I was like, yeah, I guess like what can I do to make it better? So what I did is I had purchased all of Hans books in EPUB format. So what I did is I just like converted them to text, and then I um like converted the text to like sort of these excerpts, and then sort of like gleaned out the main central idea from each excerpt, and then I sort of did this fine tuning that write this like 400 word excerpt in the style of Han Kang given this sort of theme.
So
And
wait,
then once
I
I
just want to pause there. So I just want to,
yeah
just so I'm clear on what happened. So you fed all of her work via the API. You fed all of her work to ChatGPT, and Then you said you basically fed these excerpts. The prompt, just to understand, because this is key for people to understand, for what you're doing to this point, and I think a big question is like what comes next, is you're giving a very descriptive prompt of precisely the kind of scene that you wanted to produce.
Yeah.
Is that right? So you have this
Yes.
scene
Yes.
of her mother
Absolutely.
talking about this child she lost to the narrator. You're giving it a prompt that's essentially in the style, of Han, Kang. Write this thing
Yeah.
that describes this series of, is that right? This series of facts.
Absolutely. Yes. 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 And I guess like people who still use AI to write, I mean, you can imagine that, I mean, not everyone who is using AI to write is writing slop, right? I mean, they can still come to you and say that I claim authorship because the idea was mine.
Right.
Like I told AI that write about this scene. Now, of course, AI doesn't know how to write, so it'll write it in a very bad way. And then if you just verbatim use that, then people will laugh at you. But my entire point of this experiment was that if the original thought or the idea or the experience comes from me as an author,
Right.
how does AI put that into words in a way that resonates with both me and the rest of the readers?
Right.
So and that's the intent of an author, I would say, right? I mean, author has like thoughts and ideas
Yeah.
and plot in their mind, and then they are executing it in a way, but sometimes that execution is not perfect, then their editor works on top of it, or like
Yeah.
they rewrite and stuff. So my goal was that as a first draft, what is AI producing? Is it producing something very polished? And you would imagine AI to do that because it's an algorithm, right? And of course, if it's been trained on all of her writing, it's very aware of her syntactical tics, her grammar, her rhetorical flourishes. So the prose that it produced was very moving.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I read it. So I did that experiment. It didn't take like much time. It took like an hour and a half to do the
Yeah.
fine tuning. And then once the model was fine tuned, I was like, oh, this is very interesting. So I had just read her book. So I took that and I put that and then I sort of like put them both side by side and sort of like compared. And I was like, oh, this is great.
Right. Maybe better, maybe worse, but in the same ballpark at a minimum as the actual thing. That what it created, I mean, this is so weird in a way, right? Like what it created was something very similar to what she wrote, right? I mean, and I'm trying to remember did you publish that, or was there first a kind of intermediate stage where you just kind of like sent it to some friends or sent it to some people and kind of got their feedback?
No, I mean, at that point of time, it was just part of the experiment, and our paper is now under review at this like Journal of Law and Technology because again, this paper was, even though we are talking about the creativity aspect of it, this was very much about copyright, right? Because I mean, technically, this should be illegal. You should not be allowed to do that.
But you have, I think, and maybe I'm getting published and unpublished papers confused because you've posted some stuff as preprints. But what you found when you did this with various authors, I think you ended up training it on 25 or 30 different kind of highbrow authors, and then you found a kind of panel. So you did a similar thing, but I don't know if you included the kind of regular authors.
It's the same paper.
Right.
It's the same paper.
Yeah, you found a bunch of very sort of sophisticated people with taste by whatever criteria, and you had them evaluate. You had them compare the actual author-generated text to excerpts that you generated in this way. And what you found was, by and large, not perfectly, but they preferred the AI generated version of all of these highbrow authors to the original. And then in Vara's, this was a clever thing she did in her essay where she talked to you. She actually had you do it on her own writing, and then sent your AI generated versions of her writing to things that were not online. So they had not previously, they had not been published. They were not part of the AIs, even the fine tuned AIs training data. And she sent it to her friends, and they got it like horrifically wrong, right? Including, who was her friend?
Karan Mahajan, who's a professor.
Right. Who's a brilliant writer, right? It's just, we can dismiss the MFAs, right? Maybe they suck, but like, it's just the empirical data is brutal, right? At least at an excerpt level, right? And that's a big
Yeah.
question, right? At an excerpt level, the empirical data is brutal. If you train them on the authors, if you give it a descriptive prompt of what you're trying to
Yeah.
do and evoke, it seems able to produce writing in that author's style that people with taste,
Yes.
by whatever criteria we would discern that, award-winning novelists can't tell the difference, and in some cases prefer AI to human.
Yes. Yes. And one of the wonderful things that you said in all of this is taste, because I guess like even though this experiment is kind of like weird and futuristic, I still feel the people who would be benefiting the most from this experiment are people who already are well read, who know what good literary fiction is and who has the taste. If I give this to, and we have some experiments planned up maybe later part of the year where we want to see that is this kind of thing, is it doing some sort of democratization effect where like now someone who could never write literary fiction can write it with the help of this kind of thing, or it's a sort of expert amplification effect where someone who already wrote good literary fiction or like decent literary fiction can even write better with the help of this kind of tool. And my inclination is to say the latter, because I
Mm.
still think that someone who has never read Han Kang would not be able to use a Han Kang doppelganger to write high quality fiction, because they don't necessarily know what is it in Han Kang's writing that readers appreciate, or like they have never connected to, if they've not been exposed to that kind of writing, it's hard to appreciate that. And here everything comes to taste, right?
But wait,
So
I would push back on that framing a little
yeah,
bit, because what immediately occurred to me when I was kind of just reading your stuff and thinking about it was yes, that, but that is actually underestimating the role of taste in sort of other genres of fiction. It's just a different sort of taste, right? So if you are a
sure.
big, and I was a big fantasy and sci-fi reader, right? You can be a very, when I was a kid, and I still read it sometimes, but you can be a very discriminating sci-fi and fantasy writer within the kind of conventions of that genre. Now, it's not as sophisticated. It's a different kind of taste. It's probably a less refined, in some sense, taste. But the other thing somebody could do, if they were a huge fantasy writer, if they loved Anne McCaffrey and the Dragons and Pern, I don't know how many of my readers will get that that reference,
Yeah.
right? But she was a very good, but not like amazing genre writer, right? Of like, I think an early version of what we now call romantasy or something like that. If you
Yeah.
were a very discerning reader of that, what you could do now, maybe, and again, I can imagine a person, let's say, who's very good at plot but a terrible writer of sentences, right?
Yes.
So if
Yeah.
you could lay out the entire, if you could outline out in really good detail, here are the characters, here are the constituents of the world, here's the arc of the story or the trilogy, because it's always a trilogy, and then you could train it, because this is what people are not doing now, I think, on the Amazon slop, probably, although maybe if they've read your papers, they are, right? If you could train it on the corpus of like the 5 or 10 fantasy writers who you like the most,
Mm.
and then say, here is this detailed outline of the trilogy I want to write, that this would work for them. It would not be producing Han Kang. It would produce Anne McCaffrey, right? Like, or it would produce J.K. Rowling or something like that.
Yeah, very much, very much. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of it. The author of Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin, the first time he sued OpenAI was for this guy who had prompted ChatGPT to write a sequel to Game of Thrones and open sourced that on GitHub. So of course the author was furious, which is fair. I
Right.
mean, I don't necessarily. I mean, it's not fan fiction. It's actually he's trying to like do something
Yeah.
that
Well,
is
it's
egregious.
hilarious because, of course, the thing about George R. R. Martin is he's never going to finish his series because he's too old and he's too fat. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's like
But
again, if you're not in that discourse, like, I mean, if the guy had just waited, well, I guess, he actually wouldn't have to wait. Even after he died, there'd still be people who own the copyright. I'm sorry, it's just a particularly funny one for somebody to do because that's such an element of the George R. R. Martin discourse. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I think like whether it's like ethical or non-ethical is a question which, of course, the writer probably has still rights to Game of Thrones. So it's I don't necessarily know if this is something that the publisher would allow, because otherwise, like we all can keep writing spinning derivatives of someone's book, and some of these probably will make money. I mean, I'm sure on Amazon you'll already see a lot of spin-off of Game of Thrones. I
Yeah.
mean, these slab books are all over and people are buying it.
Fiction, it usually is, right? I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey was originally Twilight fan fiction. They just, I think in its original iteration, it actually had the names from Twilight, and then they just changed it to whatever, Christian and Anastasia. So
Yeah, that's I do agree with it.
I want to, so I want to get into the ethical stuff. I mean, I do want to get into it, but I want to bracket it because I think particularly when you're talking to writers about these things, the ethical stuff is so potent and fraught because it's threatening not just our livelihood but our identity, right? That it can cloud some of the technical things. So I want to separate out the ethical things. I think one thing I want to ask you, and maybe the biggest thing I want to ask you, like I take it as a given that you have sort of proven your case. You've proven your case that AI can already, and whatever, if you want to argue with that, there are people who argue with it, right? And some of the writers whom Vara interviewed for a New Yorker article did kind of quibble, I think like Junot Diaz and someone else were like, this is bullshit. Like, it isn't really doing it. It isn't really emulating me. But like, I take it as a given that whether or not it's doing it now in some deep sense, in 5 years, clearly it's good enough that it can produce, it will be able to produce, persuasive Junot Diaz like prose if you feed it the plot. And so then my question is about these questions of originality, and you've done work in this too. And the question is, let me start with the big question and we'll get down to the technical pieces of it. Like, how confident are you that in 5, 10, 15 years, AI will be able to produce an original novel in the style of Junot Diaz by training it on, here's one scenario, and there's all sorts of scenarios. You train it on the on Junot Diaz's full corpus, and then you just give it let's say a 500-word prompt, right? Not a detailed thing, or let's say a 100-word prompt, like write a novel in the style of Junot Diaz about this, and you give it a few sentences, and then it will be able to produce a persuasive 300-page novel in the style of Junot Diaz. What are the odds of that being able to happen in the next 20 years?
So this is, again, it's very hard to say. I think I can only extrapolate from what it currently is. So if you give a 500-word prompt, it can write a 300-page novel, and it might be good enough for some readers, but the problem is it'll still be AI detectable, because I think that if you're just prompting it, if you're fine tuning it, there are some technical limitations of fine tuning. So one thing is, like, if you're trying to fine tune the model to produce a 300 page content, it's a very long form, right?
Yeah.
So then what ends up happening is you would not have enough training data. I mean, how many novels have Junot Diaz written anyway?
Right. Not many.
What you can do, though, is very interesting, is that you can give rise to a new writing style. So say now so as you know, all these AI models, they are trained on libgen, or like these kind of copyrighted like books from shadow libraries. So now say
I'm owed a check from some settlement. I forget who the settlement was with. Was it
Bards versus Anthropic?
Okay, it was Anthropic. So apparently I'm owed a check of $1,200 or $1,300 because it used one of my books as training data. Right.
Yeah, congrats. Yeah.
Well, I haven't gotten it yet. We'll see.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So one thing is that, say if you take, like, I don't know, if you just train on Junot Diaz, you probably will not have enough
what
training
if you train
data.
on, there's thousands of public domain books, right? Like, what if you trained on all of those? Or to your point, right, like they have, tens of thousands of books that are like award-winning books, right? Or something, however you sort it, good books, right? And you fine tune. Right.
Yeah. So right now, currently, the technical limitation of producing something so long form is that it gets into the issue of degeneracy. Like, it starts repeating, or like just generating garbled text or nonsensical text, or like not even. We did this experiment couple of months back on ChatGPT itself, where we train ChatGPT to produce something short story length, like say 7,000, 8,000 word, it was not good because it just ran into like a lot of coherence issues. And that's why my experiments was done at the excerpt level, because my thought was that, sure, I mean, but you also don't want to denigrate the process of writing where it's like one prompt to a novel. That's what the cheap Coral Heart kind of thing does, right? I mean, you must have seen Alexander Alter's like New York Times article about like this company called Plot Prose, where someone just tells you one prompt to the full novel. I mean, that's I don't know. I don't know high grade literary fiction would be produced that way, and if that is, that would be heartbreaking. But I do think what will happen is that you can do iterative process, right? You can take this kind of a fine-tuned model and have some effort, like generate maybe like half of a chapter this way.
Well,
So
wait.
that will
So
still,
let me ask you a
yeah,
question, because my understanding was, and again, it's a layman's understanding, that researchers are not showing, this is true, that this is the case in the scientific field, that there is a real question about this issue of originality, right? Like that there are. I thought the consensus was like in the STEM realm that although, you mentioned it has done some kind of really deep math work, that although it has been immensely helpful already, it has always been dependent to this point on scientists to kind of generate, to provide some sort of original insight or framing
yeah,
that it can then execute.
yeah,
And I push on this because I think, like, for writers, for creative people, maybe for scientists too, though they seem less kind of somewhat less existentially kind of haunted by this. The distinction we would like to draw, and it's not quite as dismissive as stochastic parrot, but it's some higher level version of that, is okay, it can be an extraordinary mimic, but that there is some way in which novelty, originality, insight can only come from a human. And I don't know from my layman's reading, you know, like, I don't know how we understand we don't even know what that is, right? We don't totally know what originality is. And I think I'm very cautious about drawing sort of distinctions like that, because I think there's so many other things that naysayers have offered up as distinctively human that these models have already overcome. But am I right that there is this question about originality or something like that, like new things coming into the
yeah.
world, as
So
opposed to AI
I
as an extraordinary implementer of our ideas?
Yeah, and I think I always think about that in fiction, I guess, or in nonfiction. I mean, the bigger thing is people sort of like over-index on originality. I don't think the average reader always cares so much
No, I
about
don't
it,
either.
and I also,
The genre reader just wants more of the stuff they already know,
but
right?
the literary fiction reader also, like, what is original is very reference based, right? It's only original to me if I don't know what is similar to that has existed before it. So I feel,
Right.
that if I'm reading a literary fiction, it can come across as original to me if I don't know where it is derived from. It only becomes derivative or plagiarized if there is a very similar copy of that. I always feel that even as writers, I mean,
Yeah.
how will you get all these like very novel ideas unless you're drawing it from your own life or from someone else's life? And that's
Sure.
why I feel autofiction has gotten so much more popular than just the general fiction, because it's like at some point of time you're going to run out of ideas. I feel that writers are always observing their surroundings, their environment, their world. So it's like, I mean, I don't know. It's hard at some point of time to just come up with like novel ideas for every, and you have taken the paycheck from your publisher from like, so you have this sort of burden on yourself to deliver. So it's like, how will you come up with like original ideas? Like, and I guess like I've talked to some writers who've also used AI for brainstorming. So then maybe you go to AI for original ideas without knowing that it's not an original idea, because again,
Right.
you don't have the whole training data for
Right.
AI
You don't
in
have
your
all
head.
the history of human knowledge kind of in
Yeah.
your head,
So,
right? I sorry, it's funny. I was just reading. There was a blog post by a Substacker I like, Naomi Kanakia, who wrote about, there was some American writer who I think maybe she had already read and didn't realize until she then went in and read all of Thomas Bernhard's novels, that this person was very deliberately, not deceptively, just emulating in all sorts of, including like plot beats, one of Bernhard's novels. It's just to your point, right? When she first read it, it struck her as original. And then it was only after she read that, which it was referencing very deliberately, did she realize that it wasn't. But let me put it this way. I'm trying to get clarity on this. Okay, so like, because originality is this kind of vague term. Like right now, if you trained AI on all of the kind of good books, whatever your criteria were, like thousands of good books, and you fine tuned it on all of these to be like some whatever. Again, it would be some amalgam of these things, right? And then you gave it a brief prompt and you said, okay, write a 300-page novel in the style of like great writers or something like that. What I'm taking from you is it would still be pretty bad. It would collapse into incoherence in all sorts of ways. If you read the full thing, it would be detectable as AI. Can we disaggregate the different elements of that, of the things that it doesn't do now, and then ask whether those are things that are sort of technically, we have reason to believe are technically conquerable?
Again, this is very at the nascent stage. I mean, people are trying to do this kind of stuff. Like attribution is a very big, hard problem. Sometimes, even when AI is writing prose, you might not even know the distinctive language that you think is very original is probably drawn from the web or from other books. After the Grant short story won the prize,
Yeah.
I wrote this Substack post about like how a lot of the very bad metaphors or like cliches in the AI short story was basically taken from like other fan fiction websites or
Right.
like so
Worse than that,
so
when the New Yorker writer sent her own personal excerpts of her stuff to her friends, some of them in saying identifying her work as AI, they cited its like
yeah,
its
cliches.
clichédness, right? They cited things they thought were specifically telltale symptoms of AI that she
Yeah.
herself had actually written.
Yeah, which is funny. And I guess, of course, I mean, cliches even sort of like slip into the writing of the best
Of
writers. And
course.
I think that's why we have editors and that's why we have like writing is rewriting, right? That's her first draft. I'm sure she would like polish it and like make it more better, like once she like reads it through. Of course, AI will not do that because AI is an algorithm and it sort of like tries to produce something really polished in the first attempt. But yeah, I mean, I think that there definitely has to be more research in terms of like even quantifying what you mean by originality, right?
Yeah.
Because like if you're thinking of giving back to creators or like right at this point of time, I think like and I it makes me so angry. I feel a lot of this is basically responsibility of AI researchers because you guys, these AI companies, they basically took all the training data and that they are now profiting of it. So isn't it their moral responsibility to know what is AI's contribution versus what is human contribution? Why should it be the responsibility of like me or someone else to like do this? And it's very hard also, like, and I want to use this opportunity to also tell you that like if I want to do this kind of work, I would need access to all the books from libgen. Now I don't know how to do that
Yeah.
without like infringing someone else's copyright. And like right now the copyright law is so fucked up in a way that there is no way for academic researchers like us to do this and not be sued. Like today, if I go to Anna's archive and download like $1 million, 1 million fiction books to do this kind of research to study, which is actually going to be beneficial for everyone else in the society, someone is going to slap a lawsuit on me
Right.
saying what I did was, and I
Whereas
want
the
to
big
take
AI, just so I understand, what the big AI companies do is they just took it without asking, and then they
exactly
did
and
all their stuff. And essentially, I mean, it's a little bit of like an Uber going into a city, knowing that they're going to get sued for it. They're signing these big settlements, and I put big in quotation marks because they're at this point they're probably rounding errors on their
yeah.
what their what their profits are, right? And so they just took it. They don't care. They'll pay the penalties. They'll get what feels like a slap on the wrist to them. But meanwhile,
Yeah.
you cannot do it because you can't. It would not be a slap on the wrist to you. It would be the end of your
It would
professional
be a lot.
career.
And and the thing that is most frustrating and maybe heartbreaking in some way, because I feel there is no solidarity. I mean, I can tell you, writers are not going to support me if I want to do
No.
this, which is actually going to help them. Like after I did this New Yorker experiment, there was this woman, like she put a Substack post about my experiment and saying horrible things about me, and sort of like comparing what I did to like technological rape. And I was
Oh,
like so
jeez.
traumatized by reading that. And I was like, oh, I did not think that way. And she was like, oh, you did not take consent. I was like, well, it's a little bit jarring to like frame this around consent, because I'm not going to email a Nobel Prize winner to say, hey, I'm using your books to do this experiment, which by the way, I paid and legally acquired.
So
Whereas,
that
of
actually
course,
is a question. So was there not a copyright issue in what you did when so you bought the books? There was not a copyright issue in you because did you hand them over to whatever it was, OpenAI in some sense, or did they live
yeah, I mean,
in
OpenAI does not store
okay,
your training
right.
data. And for what it's worth, those were already inside OpenAI's training
Right,
data,
right,
right? Because
right, right, right.
OpenAI did train on all of that.
Yeah.
I think if you legally acquire something, and especially for educational purposes, this is fair use, right? I mean, we are
Yep.
not.
Yep.
If I were to put the fine-tuned models publicly available, where someone could use that to generate prose, that would probably
Hmm.
harm their market, and that could
Right.
violate
I
copyright.
see. Right.
What we did was like it's like a simple experiment, and then yeah, I mean
Tuhin,
that if
if you need a guinea pig on whom you want to run an experiment, I am available. I will give you the full entirety of my. This is not particularly appealing to you, but I am just so fascinated by this. But you're right; it's a fascinating problem, right? And if you put up a website and like offer that to writers, they just wouldn't do it, right? And they wouldn't do it. The incentive for them would not be sufficiently concrete and sort of short term.
but the problem is there is no one who's actually going to do the work to help them, and if
Yeah.
someone wants to help them, there is no incentive. So right now we are doing this research, I think I told you, where we're trying to highlight the number of books in genre fiction that's AI generated. And there was no way for us to do this rather than to legally purchase the books. So
Mm.
what we did is we had to buy those Kindle books, and then Kindle is DRM protected. So then what the option for us was to buy those books, take screenshot of those
Oh,
books,
geez. Yeah.
convert the screenshot into text, and then put that text into an AI detector. The only reason is because I cannot download those books from the internet, because that would be infringement. And then we emailed a bunch of authors
Yeah.
whose books we were trying to study, and we asked if they would be willing to contribute. Some people responded positively, but many people were very insulting and very harsh and hurtful to us. And they were like, "You're delusional. Why would I even help you with
Yeah.
this?" I was like, "Well, I mean, if you do not, it's only going to harm your market, and it's already doing. And Amazon is not going to stop themselves from doing it because they are profiting
Yeah,
off
no, of
it."
course. It's so, I mean, it's interesting because it is so, and this is something I've thought about and written about a little bit. Like, it is a so sort of incoherent kind of ethical universe right now. And I don't really blame people for this because this is so new and it's moving so fast. Like, I'm sure a lot of the people who are profoundly offended by the work that you're doing are also quietly feeding all sorts of copyrighted, I mean, like copyrighted material, whether it's their own or it's a colleague's or something like that, into OpenAI, into Claude. And again, I'm not saying that all of that is necessarily illegal, but ethically speaking, if you're about to be on a panel, an academic panel, and you want to be up on the work that your three, co-panelists are doing, you're going to download, and you have access to university library. You're going to download a bunch of their papers. You're going to feed it into ChatGPT, and you're going to say,
Yeah.
"Hey, can you summarize what their work is so I can ask intelligent questions or things like that?" You did not ask their consent. I know they're all doing it. I don't have proof. I know they're all doing it. And again, I'm not blaming them because it's all so fast and so fraught and so new. We have not come up with sort of norms that allow us to sort of default to them to feel like reasonably ethical people, which is, I think, what we do in all of these complicated spaces over time. As a society, we develop norms and we say, okay, and they may not be totally coherent, and it's fuzzy at the boundaries. We say, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're okay. But if you go off and do, A, B, and C, you're a bad person or something like that.
Yeah, I think the broader thing I can gather from this is there is always nuance,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you just like I think right now in public about AI, there is this kind of like it's almost rage bait, right? Like it's either you're like very morally evil, like Sam Altman kind of person, or you just like or you do not even touch AI. You're like, oh, AI waste so much water, or like AI is making us stupid. And I buy all those arguments, but then I still feel to hold the Sam Altman and the Dario Amodei and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world accountable, you need to get your hands dirty and do the kind of work. I mean, of course, Facebook is going to say that the training on copyrighted books is fine because they are not economically viable, or that LLMs do not memorize training data. But I don't know if you've read, I wrote this paper with my PhD student like a few months back, which sort of like gone viral, that when you fine tune these language models, you can extract full length books from the model.
You mean, wait,
Yeah.
just so I'm clear, and I think I understood what this was it turns out that when you fine tune it enough, that the AI is going to go back into its training data, and because of the sort of predictive nature of AI and things like that and how it works, you know, the next token predictor, what it actually ends up producing in a lot of cases is it'll give you something that's like 70% or 50%, literally verbatim the book that you have.
Yeah, because again, it has memorized everything. The bigger the model, the more the memorization. And I think that, of course, LLMs and human brain work differently, because LLMs, our brains are not like verbatim storage devices, but in a 405 billion or a 1 trillion parameter model, it is trained on all these books.
Right.
And some books are replicated multiple times on these shadow libraries. If you look at these libraries like LibGen and stuff, some popular books have multiple editions. So like now, if the model has seen the same book multiple times, the chances of memorizing it is a lot higher. And then they are just not training on the books, they're also training on the web. So some popular books are more on the web compared to like, so I feel that, but again, they have, for years, they have made us believe that that's not the case. So
Right. That they're not just reproducing just verbatim. They're not directly stealing, right? That it's just this kind of, it's this misty amalgam that sort of trains on this stuff in the way that you're training on a book when you read a book and you're assimilating it into your brain. And it's not, and it turns out it's not. I mean, in some cases it is true, and in some cases it's not true, I think is what. Yeah. I was going to say, and I don't remember if this was from your research, or this was just something in referenced in either something you'd written or written about you. But on your point on getting your hands dirty, one of the interesting findings, and in retrospect, not surprising findings, is actually people have spent a lot of time using ChatGPT are better at detecting AI-generated prose than highbrow people who have sort of taken a kind of purist approach, because they don't know that the highbrow people don't know what the ticks of AI are, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I wrote an op-ed on this in the Times of India, which is like, and I think that particular week, there were like 3 cases in India, like very high profile, where people had used AI. And like, there was this like really viral blog on the grief of adult friendship, which had gotten like 15,000 likes on Twitter. Like it was
right. How beautiful it was, how moving, how touching, how much it resonated with, you know, my experience. And it was AI.
And then it was AI. Yeah. I mean, Pangram said it's 100% AI. And of course, if you read it, and this is an interesting example, right? Because I do think that the author did significant amount of prompting. I hope so. I mean, of course, I can't tell without observing their process. But my point is, the author might still believe that they are the creator and it's not 100% AI generated because they did the prompting, which of course AI detectors cannot disentangle. They always are looking at the final product, and if it's AI written, and they'll say 100% AI. But this raises some interesting question also around the process of writing, because writing is very process oriented. It's not just the final product. So if you provide the prompt,
right,
and then the AI produces the prose, right now it's detectable because it has those ticks and stuff. But if you fine tuned on, say, like who has talked a lot about friendship, like, I mean, so say like someone like Cheryl Strayed, who's like who writes a lot of like very moving articles about life and grief.
What was her big book? It was
Tiny Beautiful Things.
No, didn't she write the one that Reese Witherspoon?
Wild?
Yes, Wild.
Yeah, Wild.
Reese Witherspoon made the movie. Yeah. But she's also she's an advice columnist, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Tiny Beautiful Things is basically an amalgamation of all her Dear Sugar columns, and I usually hate self-help, but I think that self-help is like it's like literary self-help. So I'm like, it's so good. So yeah, I mean, now think about it. If I fine tune on Cheryl Strayed's writing, So then I can produce very compelling, high quality, like that kind of
Well, so
essay.
two things, because I think, these are both sort of different cases, but they're important. One is you've shown that when you fine tune on good writing, I think you have shown that it actually does fool Pangram, right? It actually
Yes,
is
it
not
did.
detectable, right? The other thing that
Yeah.
I have done, and I'm sure you know this and have probably done it, is that you can fool Pangram is you give AI the prompt, it generates the thing, or write 1,000 word, whatever.
Yeah.
If I do enough editing and if I do
Yes.
enough
Yes.
editing of it, with my sensibility, at
Yes.
some point
Yes.
it
Yes.
ceases, and you can see different phases of this, right? I've
Yes.
done a half hour, and then it's like this says
Yeah.
it's 50% AI written. If I do
Yeah.
enough iterations of it, it then fools Pen.
Yeah. I know you were saying fools, but I don't know if we should call it fools
Right.
because you have done the work. The goal of an AI detector is only to flag the lazy people, right? Who are just taking the prompt and slapping the text on like their blog or web or whatever. If you have taken the AI pros and you have done substantial amount of edits to it,
Mm.
and then I guess depend on what your prompt was. If you just said like write me 1,000 word essay on abortion, then I guess like even if you do 1,000 amount of edits, the arguments will still be very canned and very homogeneous, so people readers would not enjoy it. But if you had a very compelling argument
Right.
about an essay, you gave that prompt, the AI wrote the essay, and then you substantially edited it to make it conducive to your style and voice. I feel then if it says 100% AI generated, that think is dishonest, and that is, I don't think it should say 100% AI generated.
No, but maybe it shouldn't say 100%. I don't have an answer to this. I mean, I'm struggling with this
Yeah,
myself. Maybe it should not say, whatever the perfect detector, right? Would say this is an AI. This is a really good AI human collaboration or something like that.
yeah,
Right now, we're in the
and
position where you can, as you said, you can. Well, I'll just use the word fool. You can fool AI by training it on, a rich corpus of some very good writer's text, right? It will produce text that Pangram does not detect as AI. It says there's no AI involved whatsoever. Is that ethical then to put it out in the world as your product? I don't know. Is it ethical to
yeah,
put something in the world that didn't involve the human effort in the way that my version did? Although you're the researcher who created this kind of workflow, but in my scenario, it created the 1,000 word thing. Then I went in and did a bunch of work, but a lot less work than it would have taken me to
then
write the
you would
thing
have.
originally, right? And I put it out there as my own. Is that unethical? Is it dishonest?
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point, and I think there is a lot of research now, or at least in the policy space, about disclosures.
Yeah.
So I guess like, so right now there's a huge amount of stigma around AI
Yeah.
use, right?
Yeah.
So I think like no one wants to publish AI generated slop, or like, I mean, you must have read about Shy Girl, like all that stuff.
Yep.
So I feel that I don't think the future is binary where everything AI generated is going to be garbage. I do not think that's the truth. And I hate to say that. I know writers feel very differently about it. And I don't think AI is going to compete with Juno Diaz or Sigrid Nunes or like Han Kang. I don't think that's AI's
Why?
goal at
But
all.
I don't think you've said anything to me to this point that makes it clear to me that it may not, and I think it's an open question, but that it may not get to the level where it can
Well,
actually produce something that generates the effect in a reader with refined taste that, Juno
I mean,
Diaz, a
well, I
Juno Diaz
guess.
novel produces.
Well, I guess so. I mean, I again, it's hard for me to say, but one thing I still feel humans are so original in a way that like humans are constantly breaking boundaries of what is novel or original, right? I mean, anything that, and you see, once something becomes too formulaic, maybe it sort of like it goes out of fashion. So I feel that for humans also to like excel and like sort of like be the pinnacle of like genius, I feel they also have to constantly break the genre, like, and that's why someone like George Saunders became so popular, because if you read his thing, it's like it's more like science fiction,
Right.
but it's also literary fiction, and it's like this very idiosyncratic like style of writing with like a shit ton of rhetorical questions, which otherwise would seem very jarring in someone else's hands, but he does it so effortlessly. So I feel that, I mean, again, I'm not saying that AI will never reach to that point, but I also feel at some point we do underestimate human genius. I mean, Juno Diaz is genius because, like, when have you read something that is so effortlessly Spanglish,
Yeah.
but at the same time, like, yeah. So I feel that
I hope you're
human.
right. Look, I hope you're right. Like you're a computer scientist. Like I mean, although, again, it may threaten your professional identity and prospects in the same way it does mine. I hope you're right. I hope to my dying day there are things I can do as a writer that AI cannot do. I desperately hope that. What I'm pushing on is I still don't know from you what is that thing that humans can do that AI can't. There are clearly things now, but my fear is you can actually you could you could simulate that, I guess. You could simulate, you could do operations, and again, I'm going to speak in very layman's terms. You could figure out tricks essentially to produce novelty. I mean, you remember in the early phase of um, the AI generated video, and this was actually the case with some earlier iterations of ChatGPT. Like it was doing more interesting things in language in a way because it had not in a way because it was less artful, because it had not smoothed itself out. It had not achieved a kind of perfect generic kind of medianness. And so, there were those videos with it was a famous Will Smith video. Wasn't there like a Will Smith
Yes,
commercial
yes,
or something like
eating, yeah, eating fries in a very
where all sorts of crazy, surprising shit happened, right? And it happened in a way that had no structure, right? It was not great art, but it felt there was an originality to it, a surprise to it. And then I'm like, well, part of me is just like, well, if you can combine that with then the sort of the polish, the execution, why would we not? It wouldn't be what George Saunders made, but why would we not be able to create a world where AI why sort of conceptually would we not be able to have AI that could do versions of that?
I think you can. So here is the interesting thing that I do feel is going to happen. So again, I think we appreciate something that is of a particular style only if it is in limited portions.
Mm-hmm.
I feel if there were too many George Saunders-esque writing on the internet, I think that would lose its aura. And I think this is what AI is doing. Like AI is
Mm-hmm.
making everything homogeneous. So I feel if everyone learns this trick, then everyone will produce George Saunders-esque thing, and then the readers will sort of like run away from it. And then what George Saunders might have to do is they might just have to reinvent their style. And I think this is something that we as academic researchers are also doing, right? You have to be very clever around shifting your focus. Like I constantly ask this to myself that AI can already do so much research. AI is doing science, and Claude just announced this new Claude science, like where Claude will do like biological sciences. So the thing that I constantly ask myself is like, if I have to stay relevant in the age of AI, what is something that I can do which AI cannot? And
Mm-hmm.
I feel I know there are a trillion things that I can do which AI cannot do at this point of time. So I, as a computer scientist, I have sort of like slowly moved into like sort of more work on like governance, policy, law, which I think is a
Yeah.
little bit harder for AI to do. So I feel that writers might also like shift their focus, right? If George Saunders was writing, I don't think George Saunders would ever write something very derivative of his previous
Right.
novel. But I
Right.
think as writers, also we become complacent about our style. We think, okay, this sells. And again, style, by the way, is not copyrightable. So I feel that
Yeah.
many authors also copy their favorite author
Sure.
style. I
Of
mean, there was
course.
this beautiful Paris Review article from this author who said that he was so obsessed with George Saunders that his first novel was very similar to his style and it didn't do really well.
Right.
So it's not necessarily if someone else is doing George Saunders' style, they're going to become a multimillionaire. I
No, I
think,
mean, I
like,
guess, but I'm saying I still think it still feels to me like you're sort of artificially limiting what we could imagine it could do, right? So yes, if everybody was like, okay, I'm going to train it on George Saunders' corpus, and then I'm going to create a George Saunders-esque novel, that will not feel original. The thing I'm
yes.
wondering about is, can we? And again, I don't know what the mechanism would be, but could we imagine a writer? Let's say it's a writer because it actually helps to be a sort of sophisticated thinker about these things, or an editor or something like that. Was saying, was like, you know, um, like originality, or maybe it's a writer and a computer scientist in kind of collaboration. Originality is what it is it's sort of taking, if you really, boil it down, it's kind of taking two or three different authors' styles from the past and sort of remixing them in a way where on contemporary content or something like that, right? So you would go back and you'd say, nobody writes like Rabelais, anymore, right? What if I were to write a sort of Rabelaisian novel about, a kind of state prison, where something like that, and go, right? And that is what would read to us, to readers, in precisely the way that like Junot Diaz or George Saunders reads to us as original. That would read to us original because we have kind of deciphered what originality is in a sense and reverse engineered it.
But tell me this, like, hasn't human authors done it? I mean, Virginia Woolf discovered stream of consciousness. There are so many of the current contemporary literary fiction writers who use stream of
Yeah.
consciousness like so much. So I feel that, yeah, I mean, you will use literary devices from the past. And yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting aspect. I mean, my co-author Jane Ginsburg, who's a copyright law professor, she told me at some point of time, she was like, what if I take like two authors from very distinctive time period and like I train on both of their books together? Does the model then sort of learn this kind of ensemble of style which then cannot be attributed to one single style? Yes, that is very much possible, and I'm very curious to see something like this happening. And if that happens, is this something experimental fiction? Are writers going to be able to adapt to it? I think right now there is so much skepticism in terms of writers using AI because there are lots of ethical concerns about like copyright violations, or like I don't think there are clear like delineations or
Yeah.
norms in terms of how to use AI in your writing, in your workflow. But once at some point, I hope that this stigma and all these things will go away. I mean, or at least these copyright lawsuits will be sort of like settled. There will be licensing and all these things. And once we get to that point where I think that there is no longer like this kind of stigma, then I can see like an expert writer, like, I mean, I don't think George Sanders would do it, but someone who went to the writer's workshop is a very promising writer. They might actually experiment with these kind of
Yeah.
techniques, but I also think they are going to be able to be successful because they have read a lot of good fiction. I mean, if you want to use
Yeah.
AI for math, you can only use AI for math successfully if you can verify and understand the math that the AI has generated. Is
Yeah.
it slop? Is it like even something meaningful, or if it's just like producing verbatim like word salad? So I feel, and this comes across a lot in economics in general, like who are the consumers of AI who can benefit the most from AI? And I always feel the people who can best benefit from the wonders of AI are people who have already trained
Yeah. Well,
themselves
isn't
for
it? I
use.
mean, in the coding world, isn't it seem to have been the case that it's been beneficial in some sense for really experienced coders, and I think you hear different estimates of this because
Yeah.
they know how to use it, right? Because they have that sort of experience and that sophistication.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
the entry level coders who are being hit hard because they're sort of not
Yes.
good enough to really use it to its maximal potential. And I think you're right. I mean, I want to ask you a few things. Like before we go, it was interesting to me when I noticed that you had taken this turn, and I'm sure it's not a complete turn, but this turn into kind of collaborating with legal scholars, where you're writing about copyright stuff. And I think even, I'm forgetting what they are specifically, but you've actually sort of proposed or sort of floated what struck me as actually very strong policies to sort of protect the interests of writers. Can you talk about that work a little bit?
Yeah. So I guess like one thing I think we should all come into terms with is like detection, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I guess like there's a lot of skepticism about AI detection. I mean, I guess like even for pangram that is so popular. I mean, on social media you'll see like every person have got on the pangram hype, but these literary magazines like the New Yorker or Atlantic or like New York Times, like they would constantly say bad things about these AI detectors, or they would like say very. I mean, in the New York Magazine, there was this really disgusting article about how Pangram is bad because it's an AI that is used to detect an AI, and it's using a lot of water and stuff. And I was like, come on, guys, like that's basically detracting from the actual goal of Pangram, because like again, you might not be interested in using Pangram, but that means you're publishing slop-ed,
Right.
like you're publishing
That's right.
and it's on you. You might then go back and say, like, the whole Commonwealth scandal was so embarrassing. Like, the writer still says he did not use AI.
That was
Commonwealth
some
said,
prize. That was the UK prize where it turned out that the winner
yeah,
was detected.
the
But then
grand,
not just the winner. I feel like then people went back and it turned out
three
that
three people.
multiple.
Yeah. Yes. So my point is, like, at this point of time, it's a little banal to say you did not use AI if Pangram is saying 100% AI, and if
Right.
it has all these AI stylistic ticks, like, it's not like rocket science to know something is AI. So my point is, like, this whole, like, adjudicating this whole thing based on like trust on writers is not like a workable solution. I feel that
Yeah.
you need to sort of like update your prior. So if you are, so my point is, like, it should be like a clean policy. If you are saying that I will not allow AI generated submissions, or I only want to prioritize human written submissions, you should do it in a way that's equitable to everyone. You cannot say that I will only accept human written submissions, but that is based on the trust of the writer, because the writer can just like lie to you.
Right.
And then you're doing yourself and other writers a disfavor, because you're still publishing AI generated stuff, but you're not doing any sort of verification. So I feel like that is very important. So and I guess like disclosures are very important. I think right at this point of time there is a lot of like stigma where even if someone used AI in a good way, they do not disclose it. So I feel that disclosures are going to be really important. And then the biggest thing I feel, which as a field people have to work, and I am trying my best to do it, is like there has to be some sort of licensing, because I feel that without licensing, if you just like let AI crawl or like download from shadow libraries or just like keep doing this kind of stuff, it's not good in general for writers, but also because of this fear of lawsuits. If AI companies stop taking new data, then what could happen is they can train on synthetic data, which means that everyone's writing becomes similar, more homogeneous, which is also what we don't want, right?
Yeah.
I mean, AI does need new data. It's just that the data has to be, because I don't think AI is going away.
Yeah.
Let's all agree. I think no matter what regulation you do, there is just so much promise in it. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So I feel that if it has to stay, how can we do it in a way that benefits everyone, just not big corporations?
Yeah.
And I feel that is a workable solution. So you probably, so the questions which talked about, like about originality, we need to come up with some sort of framework to like define attribution, that when AI is generating something, can we measure the influence of a particular document or a set of documents in the training data which led to this kind of output? If I'm saying write a fantasy story about a boy in Edinburgh who has secret magical powers, is there some way I can attribute it back to J.K. Rowling's novel? And if I cannot, then what the hell am I doing as a researcher? Like, this is a very important problem. If I'm generating, think about it as a scientist. I think it's terrible because it's trained on all of our knowledge work. And now you can generate a scientific idea using Claude and publish a paper, but you don't even know, because no one is anyway reading academic papers. Young researchers are just
Right.
going to Claude. So then I'm like, but you basically sophisticatedly copied someone else's idea and published a paper about it. So like attribution is, and this aggravates me a lot, right? There is so much money and push in sort of AI for science, but there is no push in terms of knowing where that science came from.
Right. Yeah.
And I know it's a very hard problem, but shouldn't we solve this?
So I'm curious, just sort of more in the technical space, not in the kind of legal space, the copyright space. Well, what do what's on the horizon for you? What are the kind of next interesting questions that you're trying to answer?
I think my lab is very interested in sort of like attribution as a question. And I think, so I'm currently doing some work, which is probably going to come out, which is like looking at, so as you know, humans write something and AI generates something, right? So one thing we're interested in is like trying to see, when humans write, how much of distinctive language have they borrowed from existing books that have come before? And when AI does the same, how much of that is like, so statistically, what we are finding is that all these like very avant-garde expert writers, sure, they do sometimes borrow distinctive language from other books, but it's proportionally a lot lesser than what AI does. And also, if AI is writing literary fiction, sometimes it's just drawing these kind of very jarring language from, say, genre fiction like romance or horror, which then makes the writing seem very canned or cliched. So if I'm telling the model to write a New Yorker style short story, the model works through random sampling, right? So it's not necessarily keeping all that thing in mind that, oh, if I'm writing this language has to come from the genre. So I feel a lot of the bad writing that happens from AI is because it does not understand the genre conventions. There is a lot of mismatch. So if I'm writing a literary fiction and suddenly I have this kind of very tropey language, which is there in romance or romantasy, and it's okay in those genres, but in literary fiction it just reads horrible.
Right.
So I feel that I'm trying to quantify that, and so far our results are very interesting. We saw that when expert writers are writing, sure, they have some influence from like books they have read in the past, but it's still proportionally a lot less compared to what AI is doing. So one thing I'm super interested in is this kind of quantification of that.
So
When
let me
AI,
ask you. I mean, I have a few different questions about that. One is part of the objective of this to develop a more sophisticated AI detector? In other words, could you use this on the stuff you generated? So when you fine tune it on some good author's work, and then you generate something that right now fools Pangram or is not detectable by Pangram, is part of it? Will it still reveal some of these kind of quantitative ratios in terms of influence from other
yeah,
things? And is that part of the objective, or is it more, this is another way, or is it more that we want to, when you're talking about attribution, it's almost like we want to come up with some system for kind of characterizing writing. We're not making any assessment of AI versus human. We're just really characterizing its kind of, we're characterizing it in a way that will give us a sense of its kind of, the proportions of it that are borrowed, right?
yes. I think that's so there are two goals for this. So one is like, if you are an AI detecting skeptic, right? If you believe that AI detectors don't work, can this be used as an additional evidence to tell you? Because if say for example, I have a benchmark or a ballpark that human authors, that if they write something, 20% of it is derived from existing books
Yeah.
that have come before, copyrighted books or public domain books. But then, so that's the ballpark. Now if you saw something which was 50%, so then you immediately have this in mind, oh, this seems very derivative from existing books. And then you put this on Pangram. If it says AI, then I guess you have a stronger proof to like tell the writer that,
Well, but it's
because
funny. I could also imagine, thinking about this particularly in genre fiction, where it's very formulaic. It's not the only form of writing that's very formulaic. I could imagine you going back and feeding in something from pre AI, right, pre LLM, where it says where the number is much higher, and what that's revealing
yes,
is that writer is particularly derivative in a way
yeah,
that most writers
which
aren't.
which they are, to be honest, which they are. So my point is, derivativeness alone will not guarantee any sort of accusations, but derivativeness complemented with 100% Pangram score probably gives the editor or the like experts or gatekeepers a lot stronger proof. And then one of the other intended consequences of this is that if you're thinking about licensing, I mean, right at this point of time,
Mm.
all these copyright cases are class action suit. So your individual book is a tiny drop of water in an ocean. So that itself cannot really prove anything. But if you're really trying to do these class action lawsuits or like collective licensing, you need to show that AI is not just drawing from one book, it's drawing from like thousands of books
Right.
to
If you
write something,
imagined a
right?
lawsuit, and maybe this exists, but if you imagined a class action lawsuit against Amazon, which right now is profiting from all of these self-published novels,
Yes,
that are
yes.
AI generated, you would not need to prove some direct sort of line between, text A, you know,
And
and
it's, yeah, which is very
and
hard
author
to.
B. You would be able to show, this would be a kind of form of evidence that, look, this percentage of what you're publishing, Amazon, is derivative. Um, so you're benefiting, and this is how much you profited from it. You are benefiting in some more sort of
Yes,
global
you
sense.
don't
Yeah.
need to fucking give it back to the
Right.
writers.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
I don't want this to fund Jeff Bezos's another
Right.
yacht or like another initiative, but like, can you give it back to? Because I'm just very surprised that Amazon has not done anything about it, and I'm not. Again, I know that they are very unethical as a company, so it's not surprising that they would not do anything about it. But this is a very big issue. I mean, I think that um, what people are also doing, I read the other day, is that say you have a book, it's very popular. People are writing derivative book with the same name, with your with your signature, your book cover, and just putting it out.
Right.
Because sometimes in search and discoverability, you might not get
You might not be the
your
person.
book in the top.
Yeah.
So think about it. It's like it's outrageous that, and then they are reporting on someone else to flag it as a copyright violation. No, that's your responsibility.
I mean, it's funny. Like
So
you said, like you don't want to add profit to Jeff Bezos's pocket. It would not surprise me if it turned out that some of these, not entirely ethical actors in these businesses have actually read your research. I mean, and are using it to inform their experiments. I mean, one of the dangers of being at the cutting edge of these things is like, here's how you fool Pangram. Here's how you make writing that is more, a better emulation or approximation of these writers, of course, is that you are then handing the techniques in some sense to the people who would use it. If I were unethical, which I'm not, but if I were unethical and I listened to this podcast, I'd be like, oh, okay, I didn't realize you could still fine tune OpenAI, although the window is going to close. Like, let me go, buy all the books of this writer. I mean, I would have learned techniques. I mean, maybe one reason Amazon's not worrying about it is right now they're laundering it through, because of the economic structure. They're not the ones producing it, right? So they're laundering it because of the self-publishing model.
yeah, although I wondered though, because at the end of the day, they are taking away a huge amount of royalty from these books, right? So they are definitely they are profiting. And then if you think about it, the flooding has happened more in like places like Kindle Unlimited, where Amazon gets like a monthly subscription from like people. So absolutely, they are very much aware of this problem and they're
Do you
profiteering
think they
off.
might be doing it themselves? I mean, surely, I mean, there are companies who are trying to figure out how to do this well, right? I mean, do you think it's possible that I wouldn't be surprised to find out if there's some secret lab at Amazon where they're just because right, why not just do it themselves? Why not cut out the author? They do pay some kind of there's some sort of cut that the author gets for every, I don't know if it's every page that they're read or every copy of their book that's downloaded. So some of the money that Amazon is getting from Kindle Unlimited is going to the authors of these things. Why not cut them out of the equation altogether and just produce the books themselves?
Yeah, I mean I don't know if they have an internal team or like they are also thinking that, yeah, I mean that would be even more evil and diabolical if they said that, oh, I just remove the author at all. If people are anyway benefiting from AI generated books, why don't we create our own factory of AI slop? I mean, yeah,
Let,
again, and this is why
I want to ask, I
we
want to let you go soon, but I did want to ask you, what is I don't know if there's a way, the non-technical way to explain this. How are you actually quantifying quantifying attribution, quantifying influence? Like when you say something is like that a human authored thing is like, whatever the number is, 10%, 20% of it is sort of, is it literally like sequences of words that show up in other
yeah.
texts? Okay. It's not some more subtle thing where it's like something
Yeah.
about
So that's one, like that's called lexical attribution, and that's like one way to
that.
quantify this.
Yeah.
You can actually see my Substack post on this, like
Okay.
when I did the attribution on the Granta short story. So that's like one loose way of doing it. But then there is also like sophisticated machine learning ways of doing it. Like when you were talking about originality, this is something that we plan to do. Is that is there some way I can find semantic originality like similar to like existing books? Like, so if a model generated this kind of like chapter given a small prompt, like how similar is it to like other short story chapters, like just based on semantic similarity? Can I sort of like, can I compress the text and project that embedding in an n-dimensional space and see which other stories are it similar to? Like, so
Well,
that's
so
the,
this is fascinating. What is so similar is some mathematical relationship or something like that?
yes,
What is
yes,
similar? It
yes,
is not anything we could easily articulate. This is something I've thought about.
yeah.
It's not something
So
we could
similar,
easily articulate in language. It's some sort of
yes,
it's similarity in some sort of mathematical
mathematical,
space
yeah,
that is a product of like all of this. I don't even know. I
two
don't know how
vectors.
you're
Yeah.
doing that.
So basically, what you do is you take the text and then you basically project the text as a n-dimensional vector in the space. So like I'm sure you've heard of vector algebra or vector geometry, right? So
I've
like,
heard
or
of those
vector
words
calculus.
next to each other.
Yeah. So I mean, but anyway, so like the way it works is like you have these representation of the text as a n-dimensional vector in space, and then what you're doing is you're taking like a cosine similarity, which is like a dot product. You project one vector to the other, and then you see if they lie on the same plane. Like so things that are similar will probably have a stronger like dot product value, whereas things that are dissimilar will have like lower.
Is this comparable in a way? Like I was listening to podcasts where they were talking about the ways that they've identified in some of this like intelligibility research, like they've identified ways in which similar words kind of cluster together in some kind of
Yeah,
mathematical
yeah, like
space, right?
word to vector. Yes, it's called distributional similarity.
Okay.
Yeah, like king is to queen, man is to woman.
Right.
Yeah, so that's sort of
Right.
like, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, those are some ways. And then there are also very sophisticated machine learning techniques which would just like tell you and this is again very nascent research. I don't think there has been a lot of progress on this, especially with very big language models, because these are very expensive techniques. But there is some hope that maybe this will work.
Well,
I
but
think this is something.
doesn't in some sense also this goes to this question we've been discussing about originality, which is if there are these qualities to things that humans have defined, humans with taste have defined as good or great, right? Or something like
Yeah,
that. And if they have these sort of mathematical sort of, if they have these qualities that can be mathematically, topographically, whatever, geometrically identified, that have no common sense linguistic counterpart, in theory, you could then use it to generate things like that, right? I don't
yeah,
even know what that would look like, but there could be a thing, this essence, or there could be, it's probably various things, right, that characterize novels that retrospectively we identify as great, that
yeah.
then you could generate, right? Things with this relationship, and I mean, it wouldn't be easy, but things with these relationships, and the great novels are ones that are stacking different types of it on top of each other, or something like.
Yeah, and I think this is also one of the reasons I was interested in attribution, because I think in some ways that also tells me what makes a novel great. Because if a novel is so original, where it's just very much less derived from what books say, I mean, I'm looking at Google Books. So Google Books has millions of titles, right? So now if you read a book which is already very prestigious and very good, but it has very little derived from existing Google Books, wouldn't you then be even more convinced that this is more original, because like the language is so distinctive
Can
and
you do
everyone
that?
is already.
Does Google Books API allow you to do that analysis now, or do you run into that problem? You can. You can.
Yes, it does. You basically can search for strings, and it will give you the count of and the number of books where it occurred in. Right now, there is a limitation where like you can only do 1,000 of it per day. But I mean, if you're doing an experiment, you'd probably span it across. Like, yeah, I have a paper that's coming out on it pretty soon, so I guess like I'd be happy to send it to
Yeah,
you.
that'd be interesting. I just one thing, which is so, and I think this is probably something maybe it's not surprising to people don't realize, which is that even those of us who are sort of like in good faith writing original, and we're pretty original, and let's say we are original thinkers, there's still some certain percentage of everything we write, if we're kind of a median good writer, where
Yes,
there's
yes,
sequences of words, and I don't know what the threshold is, right? It can't be the word
yeah,
be and but there are sequences of words that just kind of live in our brain as kind of like
yes,
as sort of
yes.
components that we are dropping into things.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So what we are doing in our research is like we limit to any sequence that is greater than equal to
5 words. Okay,
five contiguous words, and we look at expressions that are occurring in less than 5 Google Books. So if an expression is very common, as you're saying that I was going to the, so that's a 5 word expression. But if you look at that phrase, that would occur in like millions of Google
right.
Books,
So
right?
that
So
doesn't
that's
count.
that yeah, so any rare expression that is occurring in books, because rare expression ripoff is far more egregious than something that is more generic. So I think you have to like do this disentanglement of generic versus specific.
Right.
And I think this was very interesting in our experiments, because we looked at these expressions that was very rare, and there we saw that okay, award-winning writers are doing it a lot less than AI. Because I think for AI, I mean, because it's trained on all these books, of course it's going to derive from these books, because it's not because it's not doing original thinking, even though people would might
You know,
want to.
you could have this idea. Maybe you've thought about this. I mean, if you created a website, this is just one of those things. If you created a website that allowed people to upload their writing and get a
Yeah,
score, that
yeah.
I know. I mean, we would be fascinated, right? That would be I almost feel like I'm almost sure that it would at least go viral among writers because I think if your score was good, if you're like, actually, I'm only like the median is like
Yeah,
10% and
yeah.
I'm only 4%. I mean, you're going to show that, show that off.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the paper is going to be about. So, what we are doing, I'll just quickly tell you. So, we basically took like 500 short stories in like the New Yorker,
Yeah.
Atlantic, Harper, Granta, everything. And then we are creating AI counterparts of each of those stories. So, we summarize the story into 300-word plot and we are asking AI to generate the same story. And then we are doing this attribution. So, my hope is that the AI stories will have higher kind of verbatim
Are you
overlap.
fine tune? But then there's the other
No
question, which
fine,
you're not fine
just
tuning,
prompt,
because that would be
just
another
prompt.
that would be another question, right? When you fine tune it on that writer's corpus and then run
Yeah,
it, do they still end up with higher levels of attribution or not? Anyway, yeah,
yeah, that's an interesting thing. But again, I think I mean, fine tuning in general is a futuristic thing, and I also think it's difficult because depending on every writer has different amount of books written. So I guess like you can do this at the excerpt level, but if you really want a long form 8,000-word story, that's very hard right
right.
now.
Does
So yeah, I
it
think
pop
that's
out? I'm curious. Does it pop out kind of interesting findings? Like I would imagine there are writers who are great, for whom I don't know if it's quite at the level of pastiche, but for whom being referential is actually part of their style, right? So if you think about
yeah,
somebody like somebody like W.G. Sebald, I mean, he was very deliberately and not deceptively including long excerpts from others. So it would be interesting. I mean, that would just be interesting at a sort of like not to denigrate a writer, but just like
no,
here's
no,
a
no, of
writer
course.
who is for whom cliche and referentiality are actually part of their deliberate style, and that they would score much higher on this attribution thing.
Yeah, I think if we have those kind, and those are anomalies, I
Right?
would say those
Yes,
are like
those are
1 to
anomalies. Right?
when we would dissect that like so I mean sometimes there is literary allusion, a writer is basically quoting someone else, Virginia Woolf, in their text. I think we would probably ignore those. I think
Yeah.
we would mostly consider, so yeah, I mean
No, those
those
are
are
not
some
as scientifically interesting, but they're just. I mean,
yeah.
they're critically interesting, right? It would be yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to see the final end product. My students are still sort of like finishing it up, and I think yeah,
Are
once it's
you, did you say you are doing that work where you sort of plot stories in this kind of vector space and are you doing some of that
not,
work?
yeah, not yet, not yet. I think that's going to be like one of our upcoming projects. But right now we're doing the lexical attribution, but I think in the future we'll definitely be interested in doing some sort of semantic attribution too.
How many computer scientists are in this space? Like how many of you are kind of, do you have to keep track of to know kind of, where the action is and
Not many. I mean, I guess like no one in big tech is doing it. So no one at Anthropic or OpenAI is
is
doing it. So I
anybody
guess
in
like,
academia doing it?
well, I guess like I'm doing it. I have some colleagues at University of Maryland who are doing it. Like there are some digital humanities people like at University of Washington, University of Colorado at Boulder, who does some work on AI and fiction. I still think this is a very, very like sort of niche space where not many people are doing it, which is advantageous for people like me because then if you do something interesting, you immediately get sort of the limelight. But yeah, I don't think there's a lot of like competition or fear of being
Oh.
scooped.
It's funny. I
And I
understand
also
what you're saying, that it's a niche space, and yet I read the stuff you're doing, and I'm like, but it may be the case that real sort of profound kind of field changing insights around originality itself. I could imagine it coming out of this
one
space.
one issue doing this kind of work is that as a computer scientist, you also need to be fairly familiar with writing. Like
Mm,
you just cannot do this out of vibe. Like though I always tell that the only reason I could do the readers prefer paper that got covered in the New Yorker is because I had read a lot of literary fiction until that point where I could at least know what is good, what is bad, or like who is the writer who has very distinctive original style, who I should actually even include in the experiment.
right,
So I feel that many computer scientists don't necessarily know about these things,
right.
right? So I think like to do interdisciplinary work, you need to be
You
an
have to have
actually
both things.
interesting.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a good point, right? And it would be even a more sort of rare gem in the other direction, which is to be, a literary fiction person, whether a writer or a scholar, who has
Yeah,
the. I mean, I think that would be a harder hill to climb, right? Who has the actual technical. Uh,
I think Vohini is amazing in that space. I always compliment her. I'm like, I don't know how you do it, but she's also incredibly smart. Like she went to Stanford,
was she doing the
she went to
research, or you just mean in her capacity to understand this stuff?
no, her capacity to understand.
Yeah,
Like the article she wrote blew me away. I'm
yeah,
like, because it was so well written, but also it was not just a description of the research. It was like the framing. And she has written this really interesting article about M dash in the New York Times very
oh, I
recently,
haven't
and I
seen
was
that one.
reading it, and I was like kind of blown away that how she can take all these very complex technical
Yeah.
concepts and express it to the general public in a way that it doesn't feel like rocket science. So yeah, I think she definitely is one of those people, and she has written this book called Searches, which uses her own writing and ChatGPT feedback and like incorporates it together. And it was published by Penguin. So she is one of those like more sort of brainy experimental fiction writer, and I don't think she uses AI in her own writing. But her debut novel was nominated for the Pulitzer. So I guess like she's very interesting in a way that she understands these nuances around AI, but she, of course, herself is a very trained, qualified writer. And I feel, and I wonder, this is what I was trying to tell, that maybe someone like her is going to be able to write something like really interesting experimental fiction involving AI, which then would not be stigmatized because she has earned that, right? But if just a
Well, Sheila Heti
yeah,
has done
Sheila
some
Heti
stuff,
is a good example.
and you're right. And because of her, she just has so much of that credibility and prestige. It's not questioned in the way. All right, let me ask you
Yeah,
last few questions, and then I'll let you go. One is,
yeah.
when is your novel coming out? I mean, this is the inevitable outcome. Ultimately, is your collaborative AI, Tuhin Chakrabarty novel,
I mean, I guess that's an interesting question. I think once all this ethical stigma about like using AI to write will go away, I mean, I could potentially think about it. In my writing, I tend to not use AI, but the fine-tuning experiments definitely did sort of convince me that maybe this is a cool way to like. I mean, I feel bad and morally sort of like horrible about doing something like this, so I don't think I would be able to do it,
Well,
at
you would
least
be
in this line.
transparent. I mean, it would be, yeah. It's funny because I actually
Right.
think you could. There's a way in which you could get away with it because your justification, your credibility comes from the computer science piece. If
Yes.
you put out a novel, it would be very clear that this was like, this is what I am doing from the space of this expertise. I mean, it would not that there wouldn't be people who would hate on you. All right, I sometimes forget to ask these questions, but I have my like end of podcast questions, which is, who else should I have on the podcast? If my goal is to stay in touch with kind of current intellectual trends and discourse and things like that, who should I have on my podcast?
I mean, I think Vohini is like an amazing person
Okay.
to chat with. Every time I talk to her, I feel like it's amazing. I feel since you talk to a computer scientist who works on fiction, I think it might be helpful to talk to a fiction writer who thinks a lot about computer science. I think she's a cool person to talk to. And if you're really looking at other computer scientists to talk to, I think Mohit Iyer at University of Maryland is my close friend.
Hmm.
He is very smart, who also works on AI and fiction.
Okay.
Like he might be an interesting person to talk to. He's less, I would say, copyright law like or like this kind of governance specific. He's more interested around the intellectual questions of how can we get AI to write long form stuff.
Mm.
I I have definitely diverged a little bit from that, where I'm like more interested in the legal policy questions around that. But he might be an interesting person to talk on this space. Um, who else? I mean, it depends on what kind of topics you're interested in. I mean, I guess like
It's more just, who do you find most fascinating? I mean, that's really the quest. Like, who is it? I mean, you mentioned two people. Like, it could be in any space, honestly.
yeah, I mean, I am constantly fascinated by writers. I mean, I don't know if Tony would ever agree to be on
They
your
might.
podcast,
Yeah.
but Tony is amazing. Yeah, I mean, I read his book Rejection like in one single breath. It was just amazing writing. So I always feel very like sort of fascinated by it. I also have thought a lot about TV writing, like, some of the best shows. Like, I mean, so I guess like talking to someone at Hollywood will be
Oh,
really
that's
interesting.
interesting.
I
Yeah.
mean, because there is a lot of questions around TV writing and how in Hollywood the use of AI is sort of like very prevalent now. People are using AI to do
Yeah.
screenwriting and all these things. And some of the very fascinating movies or TV shows I've seen last year, they were fascinating because they were like so original. So I'm wondering that if that's gonna go away with
Mm.
now like so much of
If
like
it's so right, if it's so inexpensive to produce kind of competent genre formulaic stuff. And then last question, if you, and as far as I know, you have not hosted a podcast, but maybe you had, if you hosted a podcast, what would it be about?
Yeah, I think it would be like how to sort of like maintain human dominance in a post AGI world. Like how what should humans do like to sort of like stop, and I'm less interested around these questions of existential risk or AI safety. Like I don't care if like what Claude Fable can do. I mean, sure, it can do a lot of horrible things, but I think I'm more interested in what it means to be a human being, a living, breathing like human made of blood and flesh in a world where AI is doing most of the cognitive stuff. Like, what can we still do so that we have contributions that are original and meaningful, and we go to bed thinking that we are doing something good for the world?
Yeah. All right. Well, I would listen to that podcast. Tuhin, thank you so much for doing this. This was amazing. It was everything that I hoped for and more. And yeah, I mean, keep up the good work. And I hope the hate is not too not too steady. And I await your experimental collaborative AI novel. And I don't think you need to wait till all the dust is settled. I think it should be the minute you get tenure. I think it should be after you get. I think you should wait till after you get, you get tenure, and then it should come out after that. Eminent Americans, the podcast, is a production of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. It is edited and produced by David Sugarman in his capacities as deputy editor of ARC magazine. So thanks to David, to his ARC colleague and brother o' mine, Mark Oppenheimer, and to the rest of the crew at the Danforth Center. Subscribe and rate Eminent Americans on the podcast listening platform of your choice. And always feel free to reach out to me with questions, comments, etc. at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. Have a lovely day. Peace.